Okay, good evening everybody. It is a pleasure to see all of you here tonight. I obviously realize that there are many events going on your university's campus. Also, of course, tonight, so I'm very thankful for all of you coming out. I can promise you you're in for a very, very special treat. I've waited a very long time to welcome Wolf Gruner to this campus, and he's really a phenomenal scholar and speaker. And of course, I already told him to expect many hard questions from the students, right? Faculty, and of course, community members in the audience. So good evening, I'm Thomas Shapell-Guerin Chair. I am the head of the Center for Judaic, Holocaust and Peace Studies on this campus here, and also the distinguished Levine professor of those fields. Before I introduce our guest tonight, Professor Wolf Gruner, who among others is the Shapell-Guerin Chair in Jewish Studies at the University of Southern California, Los Angeles, but also the founding director of the USC Shoah Foundation Center for Advanced Genocide Studies. And many of you, of course, know that we now have acquired full access to the about 55,000 and growing testimonies of survivors of numerous genocides, not only the Holocaust, in dozens and dozens of languages. So I'm also very excited to have many language scholars and students here tonight, also not just in German, also Mandarin, also various versions of Armenian, so there's really a lot in this collection. So now, before starting out, I would like to thank the various co-sponsors for tonight's events, among others, or starting with the Department of Anthropology, Cultural, Gender and Global Studies, the English Department, the History Department, the German Studies Program, ASU's Honors College, ASU's Office for Multicultural Student Development, of course also the Temple of the High Country, the local chapter of Hillel, and some members are here, and also the Peace and Genocide Education Club. And of course, since we're doing this jointly, the USC Shoah Foundation Center for Advanced Genocide Research. Finally, of course, the various members and donors of the Center for Judaic, Holocaust and Peace Studies. Without you, we undoubtedly couldn't do this type of work. So now, Professor Wolf Gruner holds, as I already said, the Shapell-Guerin Chair in Jewish Studies, is Professor of History at the University of Southern California, Los Angeles since 2008, and is the founding director of the USC Shoah Foundation Center for Advanced Genocide Studies since 2014. He's a specialist in the history of the Holocaust and in comparative genocide studies. Gruner received his PhD in history in 1994 from the Technical University Berlin, and also his habilitations, right, the Germans do a second dissertation, being Germans, in 2006. He was a postdoctoral fellow at Harvard University, at Yad Vashem in Jerusalem, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, Women's Christian University in Tokyo, and the Desmond E. Lee Visiting Professor for Global Awareness at Webster University in St. Louis. He's the author, and now of course I might embarrass myself because as an historian I can't really count very well either, of at least 8 books, among them Jewish Forced Labor, that's a safe one, Under the Nazis, Economic Needs and Nazi Racial Aims, which Cambridge University Press in 2008. He has published written more than 60 articles and book chapters, is the co-editor of 2 books and soon a third. One of them, the translated, updated book, The Greater German Reich and the Jewish Nazi Persecution Policies in the Next Territories 1935 through 1945, which was published by Berkan in 2015. One of Gruner's most recent studies, now the Spanish, I won't dare, Los Parias de la Patria, in fact, focusing on Bolivia in the 19th century, was published in Spanish with plural editores, Bolivia in 2015. Again, one of his many, many contributions. So as I said, you're in for a treat. The overall format for tonight, and then I really stop, is in fact we're going to have a talk of roughly 45 minutes, and then afterwards there's going to be ample time for Q&A. So by all means, of course, think about good questions for our, in fact, guest here tonight. So I could go on, as you undoubtedly have already have the sense, but I won't, because obviously you're here to engage with our guest tonight. So please help welcome me, Professor Wolf Gruner.
Yeah, thank you so much, Thomas, and I feel that the whole university is supporting this talk, so I'm really grateful. I am embarrassed to admit that it's actually more than 10 books now, so I feel bad. And, but I wanted to mention just my last book is actually came out in 2016 and is in German, about the persecution of the Jews in the protected Bohemia Moravia, the former Czechoslovakia, and where I'm really, let's say, glad that for the first time I could actually combine not only like the study on the perpetrator side, but also really how the Jews reacted to the persecution. And this is the last thing is actually what I wanted to talk about today, specifically not just reactions of the Jews, but really the case of resistance. So again, thanks Thomas, thanks to the center, and I have to say I'm really happy to be here in the mountains. It's my first time in North Carolina, so that's also a treat from your side. So let me start with one example, a story which occurred in the heart of the Third Reich in 1941. So this was way into the war. Hertha Reis, she was a 36-year-old Jewish woman, and she was a forced laborer at the time in Berlin. She had been earlier ordered to move out of her apartment together with her mother and her son, and she had to share a sublet with the two, and suddenly she was ordered by the court, again by a judge, to also now leave the sublet. So in front of the courthouse, after she had received this order by the judge, she exclaimed in plain daylight, in the middle of Berlin, the capital of the Third Reich, and now I quote, "We lost everything. Because of the damned government, we lost our home too. This thug Hitler, the damned government, the damned people, just because we are Jews, we are discriminated against." End of quote. So this was amazing to find this kind of trace of a public protest in the middle of Berlin of a Jewish woman after 8 years of terror, violence, persecution by the Nazi government in the Third Reich. And this story challenges in a way this widespread belief that there was a passivity among the Jews, especially the German Jews. However, as my research of the last now 9 years, so I teach and so I have only the summers to go to Germany, of the last 9 years actually demonstrates that many Jews did resist the Nazi persecution. Immediately after 1933, but often still during the war. And I think the rediscovery of such forgotten acts of resistance strongly demands a reassessment of Jewish reactions towards Nazi persecution. And what I want to do in the following, in my presentation, is first to kind of discuss a little bit the state of research about resistance of Jews during the Holocaust, and explain why I think older efforts didn't really produce many results about Jewish resistance. And then secondly, I will give you a brief overview how German Jews did defy Nazi persecution between 1933 and 1945. First, on the state of research in general. Until today, the public, but also many historians and researchers, subscribe to the idea that Jews in general, but especially German Jews, did not resist the violence and the terror of the Third Reich. The traditional perception of their passive suffering had been nourished by the fact that historians have discussed Jewish resistance during the Holocaust mostly in terms of organized or armed resistance, and thus neglected individual acts of opposition. In the beginning of the 1960s, Hannah Arendt, Bruno Bettelheim, and Raoul Hilberg, the Nestor of Holocaust research, all criticized the alleged lack of Jewish resistance. However, this was immediately questioned by Israeli scholars. And the discussion in Israel about resistance kind of focused on spiritual and moral resistance. However, in general, the academic discussion was not very heavily influenced by this discussion in Israel, and so settled still on organized and armed resistance, and mostly focused on eastern Poland and the occupied territories of the Soviet Union, but didn't really talk about Germany. Hence, a thorough evaluation of individual Jewish resistance is missing in almost all prominent Holocaust narratives. Even in those who focus on the integration of Jewish voices, like the widely acclaimed works of Saul Friedlander. And I think there are two main reasons why this is defect, and two reasons which can explain a little bit this unexpected void. First, I think there is a flawed conceptual approach how we think about resistance, or how we thought about it. And second, previous researchers only had a limited source base to kind of investigate resistance of the Jews. So first I want to a little bit discuss what I think about this conceptual framework. So what I do in my research, I'm not so original, so I actually pick up on methodological approaches from the 1970s, which are mainly forgotten, by the Israeli scholar Meir Dvoretsky, the Australian historian Konrad Creed, and the East German survivor Helmut Eschwege. All three try to open up the definition of Jewish resistance towards individual activities. Similar views were raised almost at the same time in the 1970s and 1980s in a debate in Germany about resistance towards the Nazis, but resistance in general, not just Jews. And they discussed anti-Nazi attitudes on a wider scale. And the scale was later defined by the young German historian Detlef Peukert as encompassing nonconformity, defiance, protest, and other individual actions. So what I try to do is I extend these ideas from the 1970s and 1980s and define resistance as, and here I do something very, let's say, simple. I use a very widespread definition from Yehuda Bauer, and I just add one term, individual. So the definition is the same as with Yehuda Bauer. I just add this term. So when I have this wider approach, then also non-conformism, defiance, protest would qualify as resistance. And I think this is especially justified if you think about the Jews as from 1933 onwards, but especially 1935 with the Nuremberg laws, the Jews were a group of second class citizens with no recourses or not much recourses to defend themselves. So they were especially vulnerable and exposed to the racial persecution. So what does this mean? When one applies this kind of broader definition to the Nazi societies, it suddenly produces very interesting results. So I wanted to illustrate this just looking at some photographs. So this is a photograph which you can find in a lot of Holocaust standard works. It usually illustrates the terror of the stormtroopers in the beginning in 1933, and it's taken in Munich, and the man in the middle is a Jewish lawyer, Michael Siegel, and he was dragged through the center of the town. They cut his pants off, and so usually people think about this as a kind of a symbol of terror. But if we look closer, we see the sign, and the sign actually says, "I will not complain at the police anymore." So he was not dragged at random through the city. They actually dragged him because he protested because of a client who was arrested. So there was a reason for this. Or let us take this photograph. I usually use this in my teaching in my Holocaust lecture class, but to illustrate the kind of local restrictions on Jews, because she is standing in front of the entrance of a public swimming pool which was now forbidden for Jews. However, look at the photograph. What does the body language actually say? She stands in front of this, the picture is taken, and she is not kind of backing down. She looks in a way kind of, you can't do this with me, right? And my favorite picture is this one. This is from Vienna in 1938, and this is Litzi Rosenfeld. Litzi Rosenfeld was a young Jewish woman in Vienna after the Anschluss, and she is sitting on a bench only for Aryans. So what she does is actually, she commits two crimes. Not only as a Jewish woman sitting on a bench for Aryans, but she also is actually letting somebody taking a picture of it. So only revisiting well-known photographs is already kind of changing our picture in a way. So, but in my research, I am not only kind of accumulating stories, examples of Jewish defiance or protest. What I try to do is to kind of connect them to the very complicated and often contradictory persecution policies of the Nazis. And this is only now possible after the last 15 years, and this includes also my own research, demonstrated us a much more complicated, much more rich picture how persecution actually unfolded. It was never just from the top in Berlin. There was a lot of initiative coming from the bottom, from municipal governments. And when I look at these cases of protest or defiance, I see that a lot of them are not kind of directed against, for example, national laws. A lot of them are kind of protesting local restrictions. So, the second explanation why we don't know so much about individual resistance is that there was a lack of sources to actually find examples of individual defiance in protest. And there's a reason for this, because historians usually used official reports of the Gestapo or the SS to look into Jewish behavior. But resistance won't actually appear in these reports because the Nazis were not interested to depict Jewish as defiant, right? So what I do is I use a whole set of unknown sources which were never touched for this reason, and it started by coincidence when I looked at logbooks of police precincts in Berlin. And I was not looking for protest or resistance, I was actually looking for traces of persecution. And when I went through these logbooks of 30 surviving logbooks from Berlin precincts, between thousands of short reports about drunken people, stolen bicycles, damaged doors, car accidents, cases of exhibitionists, suddenly I found notes about arrest of Jews who protested against the persecution. And this was striking to me because I had already done almost 20 years of research on the Holocaust, and I had never came across these kind of public protests. So what I then did, I not only systematically investigated these logbooks and other police reports in Berlin, but then I thought, since the police noted them as political arrests or political crimes, I thought I look into trials about political crimes. And I went to special courts. And these special courts were established after 1933 to deal with kind of political opponents. And we always thought, as historians, mostly they dealt with communists and social democrats. We never thought about if they would actually deal with Jews. But when I went to these materials, suddenly I found dozens and dozens of cases of Jews punished for protest and other crimes. So then I thought, maybe this is just Berlin. Berlin is a metropolis, it's much easier to kind of express yourself than in a small town. So maybe I should kind of do a comparative study. So I went to other towns and I studied Hamburg, Vienna, Frankfurt, Leipzig, Dresden, Munich, and then also smaller towns. And interestingly, in all of these local archives, I found similar cases of like public protest, but then even a much bigger variety of all kinds of defiant acts against laws, local restrictions. And some of them were not punished by special laws, but by regular courts. So this was already astonishing what I found there. And then I added one important source, which was already mentioned today, the Visual History Archive of the USC Shoah Foundation. And I studied 170 testimonies. And on the one hand, it was interesting. A lot of what people told in the interviews confirmed my findings from the archives. But then I found actually in the testimonies also perspectives which I never had the chance to see in the archives. So they added new facts and perspectives. So this is a long introduction. Now I come to the part where I can share a little bit of my findings with you. So now I want to give you a brief overview about protest and defiance of Jews in Nazi Germany after 1933. So as police records and also trial testimonies as well as the interviews from the Shoah Foundation reveal, Jews protested against the Nazis' persecution in public from the very beginning, practically from the first day. In Frankfurt, several Jews were prosecuted in March and April 1933, that means 2 months after the Nazis took power, for criticizing in public the beatings and murder of Jews by stormtroopers, as well as the torture of Jews in these first wild concentration camps. One example, on April 1st, 1933, this was the day of the notorious anti-Jewish boycott of shops and lawyers' practices. The state court in Frankfurt am Main punished the merchant born in 1908, Erich Löwenstein, for spreading rumors with a brutal sentence of 1 year in prison. Just a few days earlier, Löwenstein had spoken with some acquaintances who happened to be member of the rising Nazi party, and he interrogated them about the goals of Nazi policies towards the Jews, asked them if the Nazi party really wants to drive the Jews out of Germany, and then finally he inquired about the spreading rumors and news about the torture and murder of Jews. And he was punished for this with 1 year in prison, as I mentioned. But as police records and also the testimonies show us, Jews did not stop by just verbally criticizing the persecution in the beginning. They also actively fought Nazi propaganda and the regime itself. So, for example, Jews were arrested in Munich and Hamburg for besmearing displays of anti-Semitic newspapers, for contesting the Hitler salute, or for destroying Nazi flags, posters, and symbols. And I want to share one example of this with you. In Hamburg, in 1936, the merchant David Bernstein tried to destroy the swastika sign on a local bus. He took his walking stick with both hands and scratched the sign 3 times. I hope you can see the scratches in the back. I don't know if you can notice. So he was denounced by the bus driver of the public bus. And here you see one of the first attempts of historical reenactment. This is not David Bornstein. This is actually the bus driver who demonstrates for the Gestapo how Bornstein was kind of scratching the swastika sign. This is part of the Gestapo file, and Bornstein received 5 weeks in jail for the attempt to destroy the swastika. Other Jews decided to join communist resistance groups, producing leaflets, working as messengers, or in Frankfurt, Ephraim Wagner even mixed explosives together together with 3 other Jews in 1936. What I noticed in Defiance is that especially waves of attacks onto Jewish shops, physical violence against Jews, kind of produced reactions of the persecuted. I don't know if many of you know, but in summer 1935 there was a wave of attacks against Jews in Berlin. This kind of spread throughout the city for several weeks. And in July, a business card-sized flyer was found in mailboxes in the city center containing the following message. And I cite, "Germany is a cultural disgrace today. I'm a German Jew and loyal to the emperor. In fact, the Germans should expel the foreigner Hitler. Down with Hitler." End of quote. Interestingly, it was anonymous and signed with King Cone, and Cone was the most used family name by anti-Semites, actually, against Jews. So kind of here you see the twist around. Yeah? So during the months when the flyer, this kind of flyer was found, this is the report about the flyer, the Berlin police arrested more than 100 Jews in Berlin, just in this 1 month. And most of them for offenses against the German state and the Nazi parties. That means, obviously, like protest against the persecution. And more interestingly, the Gestapo mentioned in this report that Jews were born with disrespect for the state authority. So the summer riots were accompanied by a wave of new local anti-Jewish measures, which limited, or which were followed by Nuremberg laws, and then limited the kind of freedom of movement of Jews in localities in Germany even more. And all over Germany, from Cologne to Königsberg, many Jews not only ignored the local prohibitions to visit, for example, public swimming pools, theaters, cinemas, they also protested against this, sometimes in writing, sometimes in public. Verbally. Others went to German courts demanding their rights, for example, to fight dismissals from jobs. And some spoke up in public, as in Frankfurt, Rosalie Kowalski. She was born in 1887, and she repeatedly cursed the Hitler Pact in public and told everybody Goebbels would just tell lies. For those comments, she received 6 months in prison in 1937. She was punished under this law, the law against treacherous attacks, which was enacted in 1934, also mainly used against political opponents, but what I found out, it was really used widely against Jews and tried to help to punish critique and quell protest of individual Jews. And this was overlooked until now. However, even more astonishing are facts about acts of Jewish physical self-defense, which emerge in numbers from the new sources. In Frankfurt, the 32-year-old Oskar Junghans did beat up a teenager from a group of Hitler Youth guys who aimed with slingshots at Jews who left the synagogue in 1936. And when the father, a stormtrooper, tried to help the teenager, he also beat up the stormtrooper. From the Shoah Foundation Visual History Archive, we get even more mentions of physical self-defense. This is more rare in the paper, let's say in the archives, but the testimonies speak quite often about this. So for example, that Jewish men got into brawls with stormtroopers on the street, with Nazi neighbors who were discriminating against Jewish neighbors. For example, in the case of Joan Winter's father, he knocked down a Nazi neighbor in his apartment house who forbade on his own Jews to use the elevator. Or Frank Teilig in Berlin, who beat up 2 stormtroopers who terrorized his landlord. This was an old Jewish lady who was the landlord in this apartment building. There were even mentionings of physical resistance against authorities, and I share one testimony with you if this works well.
Germans have a perverse respect for courage or something. Der Stürmer, that was a German newspaper which I can remember, so it was always displayed in glass display cases on public buildings, and I can remember so well looking at it. You know, they had these horrible caricatures of Jews, you know, these little threatening men with these hooked noses. And in any case, Der Stürmer had, when my Uncle Fritz's father died, who had also been a lawyer, there was a front page story in the Stürmer. His name was Joseph Thal, that when Dr. Joseph Thal died and the authorities went into his home, in his basement they found the bodies of Jewish virgins and children. And he had probably used their blood in Passover rituals. That was the story on the Stürmer. My Uncle Fritz, his son, had been an officer in the German during World War I, and as a matter of fact had won the Iron Cross, which is, I don't know which is the highest, but a very high decoration. And when he read that story in the Stürmer, he put on his World War I uniform, his riding boots, his riding crop, put his medal on his chest, and went down to the Stürmer's office. And Streicher, Julius Streicher, was the editor. And he marched up there in his uniform and up to the receptionist and said, "I want to see, Herr Streicher." And the receptionist said, "I'm sorry, you have no appointment." And my uncle just sort of pushed him aside and walked in there and walked up to Streicher's desk, and Streicher looked up surprised, to see this uniformed German officer. And Uncle Fritz said, "Did you know Herr Dr. Joseph Thal?" And Streicher said no, and my uncle took his whip and said, "Then meet his son." And beat him a couple of times. Turned around fully expecting to be arrested, to be shot, to be something. Walked out. Nothing ever happened to him.
So this is a remarkable and almost unbelievable story if you think about that this was the head of the most prestigious anti-Semitic newspaper, close friend of Hitler. However, there's another testimony actually corroborating this. So that's, and if you think about this in the broader context of all these Defiance acts, it's not so unbelievable anymore. However, not every Jew was like this. So there were many Jews not doing anything or not having the possibility to react. Or, and I say this really with conscience, sometimes it's also about possibilities. And so, for example, Paul Malch, a leather product merchant from Düsseldorf, he wrote hundreds of letters to his son in the United States. The son was already emigrated, so there is in the Holocaust Museum in the archive, there is a big package of letters, more than 300 letters. Not even one letter contains any critique of the Third Reich. However, there are 2 letters on stationaries of a Dutch hotel close to the German border, where he could go still in 1937 as a merchant. These 2 letters are very different than all the other 300 letters. They are full of the fiercest critique you can imagine about Hitler, Goebbels, the persecution. And here, with this, for the first time, I also understood in a way why so many letters we know are not really issuing any kind of critical comments, or sometimes not even mention what was going on. This was really out of the fear of censorship. Yeah? So interesting is that letters are not a good source for what I'm kind of sharing with you here. So this explains this kind of apolitical mode. Let me come to the program of November. So, during the devastating German-wide Kristallnacht, Jews also responded actively in a variety of ways. Some saved religious objects in burning synagogues, others secured goods from devastated and vandalized stores or apartments, and some even shot pictures or took down addresses of all the destroyed shops in their towns and cities. However, most of those who took pictures with cameras were arrested, and I found the arrest notes in the police logbooks. So the police or the Gestapo would arrest them, they would confiscate the cameras and the films. Some of the pictures we know from the Kristallnacht may have taken by Jews, although we don't know this, but here, for example, this is clearly a picture which was taken as a resistance act. I don't know if this was taken by a Jew, but I just wanted to illustrate that they have a very different kind of imagery. So this is taken from the other side of the street, from the second floor or the third floor of an apartment building, clearly to document the devastation which was a result of this violent night. So, and also during the program, and this is even more remarkable, Jews spoke out against the violence and the persecution. For example, Henriette Schäfer, she was born in 1882. She entered a shop and asked the owner, quote, "What are you saying about the fact that everything is being destroyed and the synagogues are arsoned?" End of quote. The neighbor responded, "Yeah, the people are outraged about the murder of the German diplomat by a Jew." Schäfer replied, quote, "This is not the people, but the government. They are all blackguards, scums, and criminals. Hitler is the biggest bandit. If I could, I would poison them all." End of quote. She was denounced and got 6 months in prison for this comment. Or Diane Jacobs, she was 16 years old. At this time, her name was Daisy Gronowski. She was from Berlin, but lived in a Hachshara training camp. I don't know if everybody knows. These were these kind of training camps for the Jewish youth to prepare them for immigration to Palestine, and via kind of agricultural training. So she was in West Germany in this camp, and this camp came under attack by stormtroopers. The stormtroopers start to kind of beat up the teenagers in the camp when they raided the camp. And I tried to share another testimony with you. You see, I got
you know, the youngsters and the boys, they were bleeding. And then all of a sudden it came my turn and said, "Hell, I'm not going to run. I'm going to walk. Here I am. I mean, 5'0" I'm 5'1", 5'0", and I'm a skinny little girl." And all of a sudden, it wasn't any fun anymore. And I remember getting one on the back. That was it. I just walked through very slowly, looking at all of them. Now here, big tough guys. You want to hit a little girl? What can I do about it? You know, it's the attitude. And I only got hit by one, and the back would hurt. And I got to the end of the line, one of them grabs me, grabs this hand, the right hand, and starts sawing into it with a rusty knife. Pocket knife type thing. Well, I'd learned a little trick, and that's sticking my head into someone's stomach, which doesn't feel great. And I turned around to see what I could do with him, and I started fighting, and I started kicking with my legs, his legs. He wasn't very big either, and he was young. Anyway, I finally managed to get my head out and under the knife. I twisted the knife out of his hand, I used the knife, I stabbed him, and I dug my head into his thigh. I know how I did it. It was just a fast thing that they had told me. And the others didn't notice it. So a couple of the guys, the others were too busy beating up on him. So a couple of the guys saw it and they dragged him underneath a bed or some kind of a sofa type thing that had been kicked over so that the others wouldn't see him. He was bleeding. He wasn't dead, but he was bleeding. Anyway, that's when we took off.
So this is one of the remarkable stories I found with, in the archive, and in my book, what I'm writing now, where I tell several stories, this is one of the stories I will tell in much more length. And just to explain how could she do this as on 5'1". So she was part of Shomer HaTzair youth group in Berlin, and they got her jiu-jitsu training. So this was what she was kind of talking about. And by the way, when I talk about these individual cases, some people resisted just one time. She was one what I call resistant careers, because after she had rebelled before that, she had, and afterwards she got arrested. She escaped, I think, 3 times from transports and camps, and made it actually out before the war started to England. And she is a kind of, she herself calls her a rebellious character. So after the pogrom, there was a wave of new national but also local restrictions, and the especially national decrees. And the archives in all the cities I visited are full with dozens of files showing that Jews disobeyed these new national rules. For example, to hand over precious metals, which they were forced to wear special identification cards marked with a J, or to adopt the discriminatory middle names Israel Sarah. And this was one of the surprises to me, because I was always thinking, okay, the Nazis forced them to wear the middle name, that's it. And everybody got the name, and that's it. However, this was a German state. You had actually to apply for a name change. That means there were forms to fill out. You had to pay a 3 Reichsmark for it. And then I find in the archive dozens and dozens of cases where people just didn't do it. They didn't fill out these forms. For example, in Berlin, the 60-year-old painter Max Antlers declined even repeated requests by the police to fill out the forms. And he still resisted when he was kind of called to the police station. Or in Leipzig, Ida Schneider, she didn't apply for the identification card, refused to use the name Sarah, and she was only detected in 1941. That means 2.5 years after these decrees were enacted. She received 7 months in prison for not wearing the name and the identification card. Other Jews still, again, different laws and restrictions spoke up. For example, in the Vienna's housing office, that means in the housing office of the municipality, Dr. Arthur Singer loudly cursed Hitler after having been expelled from his apartment in 1939 in summer. In the office, or in front of the office, he even urged his fellow Jews, there were a lot of Jews waiting in front of the housing office, to join him in this protest and against these new city orders, and to storm the offices. And some people didn't even stop when they were already punished. So for example, in Berlin, the former tailor Alfred Levitan, he was born in 1913, so a little bit younger, he had already been punished with prison, 9 months in prison, because he had made public comments harming the German state. In prison, in spring 1914, Levitan smuggled letters into mail order catalogs, which were printed in prison, calling for an uprising and blaming Germany's war on Hitler's mistake to persecute the Jews. When I talked about local restrictions, there's a huge variety of those, and Jews also ignored the variety in every city. And for example, in Berlin, in July 1940, the Berlin police chief was introducing limited shopping hours to prevent Jews from having all the time of the day to do their groceries, so they were kind of restricted to 1 hour in the afternoon, which meant they almost got nothing in the grocery stores. So Hedwig Honung, she was a widow, ignored this rule and went to a shop, and then the shop owner kind of obeyed the Berlin rule and said, declined the request to sell her bread. When he did this, she snapped and exclaimed, quote, "The new decree, that is too much. Soon we won't get ration cards anymore either, and we will die of wretched. End of quote. After being denounced, she got also several months in prison. Or many Jews actually broke the newly introduced curfew for Jews, which was introduced right after the war started. And often they did this at the same time also breaking these local restrictions. And this is one of the few incidences I found in the diary. This is the diary of Max Mannheimer, who was a forced laborer during the war at a road construction site in Bohemia. And now I quote, "My home is in a wooden hut behind the tool shed. From there I go to the public park despite the 8 p.m. curfew and despite the ban to visit the park. On my way I count the signs with the slogan 'Forbidden for Jews.' In total there are 6 signs. Later at 11 o'clock, I rip out the signs out of the ground and throw some of them in the bushes, some of them in the creek. However, all my courage proved futile. The next evening, all the signs had re-emerged. And for a second time, I don't have the courage. I am just not a hero." I kind of would dispute this, because if you notice, he not only did this once to kind of break all these local restrictions, he went the next day actually again to the forbidden public park and so on. And this is, I think, one of the main problems, that many Jews didn't really perceive what they did as resistance. Yeah? And that's why we kind of, a lot of these acts are forgotten. So, I'm now coming more and more to the end. Just to share one other story why somebody kind of broke the curfew. In Frankfurt, there was a 17-year-old boy called, his name was Hans Oppenheimer. He came just out of a forced labor camp back to his hometown, Frankfurt, because the road was constructed, or was finished. At home, this was the time at the end of 1940. That means the Allied bombers were starting to kind of closing in and starting their bombing campaigns in Germany. He went out every night in December 1940, breaking the curfew and waiting for the Allied bombers to close into Frankfurt. And when they came, then he set off wrong fire alarms to divert the firefighters from the actual bombing sites. He did this more than a dozen times. Actually, the trial says he did this 9 times, but at the same time, in the same area, in total there were 45 times counted of wrong fire alarms, but they couldn't kind of get proof or evidence for him that he was behind all these attempts. He got 3 years in prison for this, and was later deported right from prison to Auschwitz and perished there. So the last 2 examples I want to share have certain qualities to it which are remarkable. In Munich, the former real estate broker Benno Neuburger sent out dozens of postcards between fall 1941 and spring 1942. And he sent out postcards with very, from our view today, 4-sided comments on them. For example, and I cite, "The eternal mass murderer Hitler, disgusting, exclamation mark, or murderer of 5 million. This was perceived as so grave that he was brought to Berlin to the People's Court. He was tried for treason, and on trial he argued that he hated Hitler especially for his pronouncement of January 1939 to exterminate all Jews, which he really made in public. He received the death penalty and was decapitated in September 1942 in Berlin. A lot of the resistance acts also kind of are actually known, and you probably all heard about cases where Jews went into hiding. And when you think about these individual acts, I would perceive hiding is one of them, because it's a direct action against, let's say, the will and the plans of the Nazis. And the most remarkable of those is actually an uncoordinated action in Berlin in 1943 in February, where the mass deportations were supposed to come to a close. There was a big raid of the Gestapo in all factories to kind of round up all the remaining forced laborers. And in this one day, 4,000 Jews went into hiding in Berlin. Think about the number, 4,000 people. And there was no kind of, like you say, organization. Everybody did this on his or her own decision. Sometimes warned by foremen, sometimes by neighbors. And they all went into hiding. 1/3 of this number survived, the rest was caught sooner or later in Berlin. And when they went into hiding, they were not just trying to survive, some tried even to prepare for the moment that they might get caught. This is the last story I wanted to share. This I found in a police logbook in Berlin. And the story goes as following. In August 1943, this is a moment where Germany was already perceived by the Nazis as cleared of Jews. However, at the evening of this of one day, policemen shot in a plain street in Berlin Kurt Jacobsen. And immediately they saw him, they called his name, and then they shot him. Why is that? They had discovered that he was not only using a forged identity in hiding, but he had actually, as a former forced laborer, he was recruited by the guy who organized a former Jewish company. He had no clue about managing or running a company. And then when he discovered that one of his forced laborers, Kurt Jacobsen, was a former merchant, he actually said, run the company for me. He gave, so under a forged name, he gave him even a secret apartment in the factory. And so Kurt Jacobsen lived with his wife incognito in this factory, managed the whole firm, and only by coincidence, the Gestapo did a raid of the factory. They found a secret apartment. Jacobsen and his wife, they were not there. And what they found in the apartment was that there were several guns, live ammunition, forged papers, and suitcases. And because they found this, they assumed that Jacobsen would be armed, and that's why they shot him immediately when they encountered him in the street in Berlin. So, after I share all these stories, and there are plenty of stories, more of these stories, it is really remarkable that after the liberation, there was not much of discussion of these kind of protests, defiance, and not even in Germany where it actually all happened. And there are some reasons for this. So I did a little bit of research. What were main discussions among the Jewish community, for example, in Berlin after the war? One was, the main part of the discussion was really the discussion about the brutal extermination of the Jewry in Europe. This was one of the main kind of discussion points after 1945. And the second reason why they didn't discuss individual resistance was that they also kind of had other things to do after 1945. It was about survival, getting food, getting welfare for the families, to kind of gather the few survivors who came back to Berlin. There was not much space to discuss resistance. However, even when there was space, there was kind of a strand of thinking which didn't allow really to account for resistance. What happened is, there was a Jewish journalist who wrote in October 1945 an article about the persecution in Germany called The Yellow Star. And he writes, where I marked this, that's the passage, he writes, quote, "No, there was no resistance. Already the fathers had learned to obey," end of quote. And this is really true. I found also interchange of famous Jewish writers in 1933. One part of the Jewish communities thought about Jews would just try to survive. They should not resist. They should not be kind of active. While others said, no, that's actually not true. This is not what we should do. But there is this idea of the history of passivity which helps Jews to survive, which was very common. So let me come to the conclusion. When we define resistance in this much broader sense as any individual or group action against laws, actions and intentions of the Nazis, countless acts of defiance emerge. And now we are able to understand for the first time that in quite a few of these public reports of the SS or of state officials, there is a frequent mentioning of the impudent Jew. And including myself, I thought always when they mention impudent Jews that it's just to kind of justify the introduction of a new more radical measure against the Jews. But if we kind of take the context of all these cases here, then there was actually reality to this characterization. So, in fact, almost every Jewish man or woman developed particular kind of reaction strategies in response to the persecution. First, against Nazi propaganda and economic measures. Next, against violent attacks and local restrictions. Later, against segregationist laws and decrees. And finally, facing forced labor and deportations. Jews spoke up whether in offices, restaurants, on the streets, in their neighborhood, or at home, in their apartment homes. They wrote anti-Hitler postcards and leaflets, and even defended themselves physically. And this was much more common than we actually previously assumed. Interestingly for me was, when we look in general onto all these cases, that courage, this kind of courage, would be found in all elements of the Jewish population, regardless of gender, age, beliefs, or social status. So there are no kind of parts of the population, at least in my account, who are more destined to kind of protest or defy than others. And what I think as a result, my research indicates that such kind of individual resistance was no exception, but probably it was also not the rule, because it often depended very much on the conditions, coincidences, and kind of timeline. However, it was much more widespread than we ever imagined, and I think a lot more of these cases will be or will forever be unknown, because I could only find those who were reported and denounced, except the stories of the Shoah Foundation. But a lot of the stories will never be told, because the people were later deported and perished, but what they have done before was not reported. What I think is that beyond just the observation of these defiance acts, this should actually change our view on persecution and the Jewish reactions in general. I think from now on, the perception of a mere suffering and passivity of the Jewish population in Germany is supposed to be obsolete. And I think what will be important in the future is to incorporate these narratives, these stories, into this general narrative of the Holocaust. And this is not only important to preserve the memory of these acts, but also to understand these individual acts as deliberate reactions to diverse and changing local, regional, and national Nazi measures. As the Berlin Rabbi Max Nussbaum recalled, and I quote, "We were besieged in 100 of different manners, and therefore we fought back in 100 different manners," end of quote. And I think when so many Jews of all ages and genders would resist and kind of respond, this also gives really to a great deal back agency to the Jewish population. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Professor Gruner. So you heard a very powerful and very insightful presentation. Among others, of course, it included in exemplary fashion ways, right, in which to use this really phenomenal resource that we have now available on our campus, the Visual History Archive of the USC Shoah Foundation, in your own research and work. So I encourage all of you, be it in the context of a class, or be it, right, for your own sake or research or whatsoever, of course, to take advantage of that, and not just if you are based here on this campus, but also, of course, elsewhere, since obviously this is a public university, we take it very seriously and provide access to others. But now, I already see there's some very eager questioners. So, as we are making the transition, I would like for you to briefly introduce yourself, and then ask your question, and of course we do the response, and we'll move on to the next person. Okay, Jamie.
Hi, my name is Jamie Schaefer, and Professor, we're just so thrilled to have you here. That was a fascinating lecture. Thank you so very much. You're here at a very interesting time in history. I took a few screenshots to read you a title of an article. It was an editorial in this last Sunday New York Times. It was written by Jonathan Weissman, and the headline is, "Anti-Semitism is Rising. Why aren't American Jews speaking up?" Anti-Semitic hate crimes are on the rise, up 57% in 2017 from 2016. It's the largest single-year jump on record, according to the ADL. That increase came on top of the rise in incidents in 2016 that coincided with the brutal presidential campaign. The ADL says anti-Semitic talk in the United States has reached levels unseen since the 1930s. I would love to hear your thoughts on these articles, and there are many of them that have been in the newspapers recently.
Yeah, thank you for this comment. I would say not only anti-Semitic comments are on the rise, every kind of racist comments are on the rise, and are kind of, there's a kind of a break of a taboo that this is not, let's say, how people should communicate with each other. So I think this is a huge problem. And actually what I tried to do here is, I didn't mention this, but I thought you can extract this from my talk. If we are aware that Jews during the Holocaust could resist in so many ways, then everybody in any circumstances can and should resist too. So I think that's actually the lesson I learned from my own research. Yeah. So to speak up, to react, to respond in any ways. And I think the problem what we have here is that people think they can't do anything, but I think really when you compare this, what Jews did in Nazi Germany, then there is no justification to think this way.
My name is Devin, and what I wanted to ask is, I was doing research for a paper for his class actually, and I found some information about Jews that they would be in hiding and then they would get caught and turn on other Jews. How do you think, did you find anything about how the rest of the Jews felt about this, kind of the trail behind it?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think this is a very difficult problem because there were always discussions also that and I think this is really for everybody who resists, you make a conscious choice because you know under these circumstances you may bring into danger not only yourself as a person, but your family, your friends, your community. So there was a conscious decision to make. Should I react? Should I respond? Should I do something? And as you have seen, many did. Yeah. So naturally there was a discussion, especially in the Jewish communities and among the Jewish leadership in Germany, but especially then also in other parts of occupied Europe, where some argued when somebody wants to resist, this brings all the community in danger and we will have repercussions, so please don't do this. While others say, no, but there is no way, we need to do something. Yeah? So For us to judge afterwards, it's, I think, very difficult, and I would not do this because it depends very much on circumstances, specific conditions, and this is my lesson from all the research on about these things. The individual actions is less dependent on character or socialization or education. It depends a lot on the people around you and the special conditions you face. Yeah.
All right, I actually have two questions for you. My first question is...
May you introduce yourself, please?
Oh, sorry, May Overstreet, that's me, hello. My first question is, I know you mentioned that there was a lot of limited sources, and that's why we haven't seen a lot of Jewish resistance on the individual level before. In your research, did you find that there were intentional attempts to cover up Jewish resistance, to maybe hinder that getting out, and maybe other Jews picking up the idea to maybe do that themselves? And my second question is, as far as Germans protesting what was happening against the Jews, is there a comparison in punishment there where, like you were mentioning, someone talking about Hitler and being decapitated for treason, were Germans treated the same when they protested against the Nazis? So that'd be my question.
Oh yeah, so these are two very good questions. So the first one about, everything what I talked about trials and punishment was to try to quell this. Because for example, my book on Bohemia Moravia, they published in the newspaper the punishments of the Jews. And they said Jews XYZ was punished for protesting, for doing this, for kind of not ignoring this law. So they knew people would read this, the words would spread, and the consequences of potential actions was kind of really known. This was not, sometimes people think, oh, maybe this was unconsciously what they did. They knew what they would face. Yeah. So, so the cover up in a way is the all the punishments, the arrests, the trials, and so on. The other question about the non-Jewish Germans, so interesting is, although I didn't look for it, but since the sources were there, I actually found equal surprising amount of protests by non-Jewish Germans against the anti-Jewish persecution. So usually the public thinks there were all these Nazis, and then you had this huge mass of indifferent people, and then you had the victims. My research points to a different reality. So you have in these sources, which are really on the lowest level of the society, these police logbooks, they tell, on the one hand, you have more people joining in the violence, which were not active members of the Nazi party or the stormtroopers. So people took advantage of plundering and also really kind of launching violence to settle, what is it called, when you had to query with somebody to settle the account. Yeah, so they use these circumstances against Jews. But on the other hand, we also find a lot of arrests of non-Jews who protested against the persecution. And the only mentioning that you will find in Holocaust literature is regarding Germany and protest is that after the pogrom, some people criticized the destruction of goods because this was detrimental to the economy. In my sources, where I found dozens of people protesting, not even one protested out of economic reasons. They were all kind of because of humanity, because they were in favor of Jews, because they didn't like violence, they were against persecution. So these were much more humanistic reasons than material reasons. So this was also surprising for me because it changes the whole account how we think how non-Jewish Germans behaved. Yeah.
Hello, my name is Ryan. I'm a junior history major here at App, and I was going to ask, after the war, were there any accounts of interactions between Jewish resistance figures or with Sonder commandos or Jewish collaborators with the Nazis?
This is more difficult. In Auschwitz or in these extermination camps where you had Sonderkommandos, some of the Sonderkommandos themselves were actually resistance, right? And there were connections also to, let's say, other inmates. For example, in Auschwitz, the Sonderkommando received gunpowder, which were brought by women, smuggled by women from their from the munition factory into the camp and then to the Sonderkommando. So there were always connections, and also to other resistance groups. So I think, yeah. But on the other hand, there was not so much organized resistance, so that, for example, sometimes there were few organized Jewish groups, like in Berlin, the group of forced laborers, they arsoned a propaganda exhibition in 1942, which is not well known. Or in Bohemia, Moravia, there were very small groups who tried to forge papers and help Jews in hiding. So Jews helped other Jews in hiding. They were also in hiding, and then they tried to kind of organize better conditions to escape. Does this answer your question?
Kind of. I was more asking, after the war there were a lot of, thank you. After the war, some Jewish collaborators were accused of not doing enough to help out other Jews during the Holocaust. Did any resistance figures interact with Sonderkommandos or Jewish collaborators in a negative manner, or is there any record of this occurring?
Yeah, I don't know so much about the second part, but in general, there is a discussion about collaboration after the war. And I think sometimes this was a very emotional response right up of a few of the survivors, so to speak. And often I found they abstracted from the actual kind of specific conditions where these people were in. They didn't look at the room of maneuver what these people had. So there was often a lot of judgment, a negative judgment of collaboration. But my research, for example, on Jewish community leadership shows, I don't know any case where they didn't try. It was just really hard for them. They didn't have a lot of resources. And they sometimes even did things which you only detect when you have a great deal of knowledge about institutions. So for example, in my work on forced labor, but also now in my last book on Bohemia and Moravia, I found that Jewish communities tried during the war to manipulate institutions, Germans and also Czech institutions. And practically in a way, they, for example, in Germany, they went to the Gestapo and said, the labor office is trying to get these people into these camps. Help us that the people can stay. This was more in the earlier period. And the Gestapo said, help them sometimes. And then in the later period, when the Gestapo was deporting, they went to the labor office and said, labor is important. Help us that these people don't get deported. And so sometimes they postponed, because of interventions of the labor office, this deportation. So it was very kind of, how can I say, sometimes sophisticated actions which are not so obvious, and they were never obvious to the contemporaries. They couldn't see what they did. Yeah? And they were also always thinking about the people who had to go, and so that's why they didn't see the people who may have kind of saved their lives or could stay longer and were not deported. Yeah? It's a very difficult discussion, but I think what I see from also more recent research from other colleagues, it is a very ambivalent position, and even, for example, a graduate student of mine is doing work on Jewish physicians in camps, and they were also perceived as collaborators after the war because they executed like medical experiments, they did what the Nazi doctors wanted them to do. But when you really do diligent work, then you find out, yes, they had to, they extended the the hand of the perpetrators, but sometimes they also tried in their limits to save people. You know? And you can learn this from some testimonies and regarding these circumstances.
And while there were a number of trials in the newly founded state of Israel in the early 50s, so I'll give you some literature on that. Okay, there are a few more questions. Yes, Dr. Horace.
Hi, thank you for a great presentation on a topic that's new to us. You talk about, you talk about Jewish community leaders. Who are these leaders, And did you distinguish the religious leaders, I guess, from the administrative leaders? Did you find any evidence of the rabbis promoting resistance?
Yeah, that's also a good question and a good distinction to make. So most what I just talked now was more as administrative leadership. However, there are examples of rabbis, and I cited one at the end. So for example, one of the most brilliant examples is Joachim Prinz from Berlin. He was a young, unorthodox rabbi who was kind of even doing partying and was beloved by a lot of women, and especially young women. And he kind of had a huge Zionist youth group in Berlin. He was actually not only in sermons, but he was publicly protesting against the persecution. He gave speeches using the symbol of the ghetto very early on, that there was no ghetto yet established. He talked about that the persecution, the segregation is a virtual ghetto. So, and this was even published in the Jewish newspaper in 1935. He published books, and he was so kind of nerve-wracking for the Gestapo that they expelled him in 1937 because of all of his acts. So he's one of these more really courageous people. And interesting is he comes to the US, and the first thing what he encounters is the South and the treatment of African Americans. And then he actually is one of the leaders of the civil rights movement, friend of Martin Luther King. And so that's a great kind of trajectory from Nazi Germany to the US. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Gruner, for your presentation. I'm Ralph Lentz in the History Department, and to follow up on Rosemary's question, I'd be interested to know if in your research you found Jewish academics resisting, and if so, how did they resist?
That's a good question. I mean, some of the academics tried to resist when they were expelled from their their positions in universities. And sometimes we even find also non-Jewish Germans trying to help them. Then the problem in my sources is a little bit that a lot of these, and just to show you, a lot of my cases are just this long. Yeah, that's half a page, and the Gestapo often don't mention profession. Yeah, so I have actually more about the act. Sometimes in the police reports, not even the age. The trials give me a little bit more to work with, but so this is really hard that from the cases I investigated more thoroughly, I didn't investigate academics there. Yeah. So, but as I said, from my knowledge about all these cases, I think they are part of the, so to speak, of the whole picture.
Okay, we have maybe time for a couple more questions.
Although maybe I can add, for example, now I have two examples actually just popping up in my head, which are very well known. Diary writing was a form also of documenting what happened, and so to speak also a form of resistance. And we have two academics who actually wrote very influential diaries, which are published during the last 15 years. It's Victor Klemperer in Dresden and Willy Cohn in Breslau. And Willy Cohn was a very famous medieval historian and high school teacher. He wrote, as a friend of mine who is a medieval historian said, he wrote one of the most influential books about the fleet in the Middle Ages. And so he is really well documented in detail the persecution in Breslau in his town, and as did with Dr. Klemperer in Dresden. So I think this is part of the story too. Oh, sorry.
Thank you for your presentation. I'm Katie, I'm a history student here, and I was just intrigued about when you talked about why individual acts of resistance weren't really discussed after the end of the war. It was because extermination was on everybody's mind and they were talking about survival. So would you say that people were more concerned with remembering those who had died rather than like heroifying those who had resisted?
Yeah, I would say, especially in the beginning, this was the most important thing, is remembrance until today. And I think it is the whole discussion about the Holocaust, and this is beyond just the Jewish community, also suffered for a long time from a very simplistic view of the events. And this was part, in my view, part due to the Nuremberg trials, because the Nuremberg trials depicted only the SS and the Nazi party as the perpetrators, and not the German society. They didn't really look into it. So there was a lot of, practically, a lot of Germans could get away, that they had nothing to do with the whole thing. And this also kind of gave the impression that there was this overwhelming force, how it was depicted, a lot of terror and violence, and so people couldn't really do anything against it. And so that's why there was no more questioning, no more challenging. But I think also this kind of different concept changes our view also. Yeah? Because I think in general, when you ask the public, it is the film which is called Defiance, which kind of shapes our view, which is not about defiance, which is actually about armed resistance. Yeah. So.
Professor Gruner, I'm Chris Patty. I'm in the communication department and assistant professor. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about how shifts in the historical eye, shifts in how we do history and what counts as history, has helped to reframe and enrich this lost or less known narrative of resistance. You mentioned memoir and testimony. How has shifts in historiography helped us to see more of this, or just shifts in historical trends?
Oh, that's actually a good question, because it's a personal story. So I was trained as a German historian, and German historians, first, are very conservative. Second of all, looking into institutions, not into people. That's how I was trained. So first, when I started doing my PhD, I was looking into forced labor, not so much how they impacted the people, but more what the labor officers did, how they arranged it, what were the criteria, what were the decrees, the laws. And then I realized, there are differences in different localities. And why is that? And then I realized this depends on the people working in these institutions. And then I looked at the people, and I kind of was surprised that some of the most fierce anti-Semites were not members of the Nazi party. They were not Gestapo, they were not SS, they were regular people. So how does this go together? And then there were Nazi party members, pretty suave, yeah? They were kind of, So this kind of complicated already my view. So I did more studies, which is kind of part of the importance, I'm not the only one there, for Poland there was done research on the importance of local institutions, regional institutions. When you then acknowledge that there was not this uniform policy from the top to the bottom, then you realize there is this kind of cacophony of different measures at different places. Then you understand why people couldn't really respond, because they couldn't make sense out of it. It was not you have one enemy and there's one directive and you can be against it. There was so much going on, and you were affected by a measure, but your neighbor was not. Your city was Jews were treated differently than in the other city. So that's why many people didn't leave, because they couldn't make sense out of it, all of this. And then I looked into, okay, if there are so many different policies, then I was starting to be interested, and this is then the larger question you raised, which is a lot of influenced by the idea that we need to integrate the voices of the affected, the victims. And this is, Friedlander was asking for an integrated history, so I started also looking into, what was the impact of these policies? And then the natural conclusion, and this is how I come to my research today, is if they are impacted in a different way, how did they react to it? And that's where I am now. So that's practically a little bit the personal story of a general development which started in the, let's say, 1990s with a lot of work on, let's say, in archives, and then more and more memoirs, testimonies, diaries came into the forefront as important sources which kind of enrich, give us different perspectives, not just about the impact, but about the whole situation in certain localities. And I think the testimonies of the Shoah Foundation, because of the huge variety, really offer certain perspective which are often different from, for example, memoirs written very early on or let's say in the mid-60s, or reports written by individuals written in 46 or 47. So all together, we can make much more kind of a much more complicated, complex picture of the events of the past.
Hi, my name is Deborah Rutskin, and in your studies, have you come across or have you studied religious resistance during the time of all this? I mean, what kind of, it's just kind of impossible for me to think that this wasn't known, what was going on. And some people just say, oh, we didn't know anything.
Do you mean in Germany or in the US?
Throughout the world, yeah, US.
Yeah, I mean, there was, from the beginning, there was a reaction. I mean, here in the US, there were demonstrations, religious leaders and community leaders, Jewish and non-Jewish, were actually working together right in 1933. They organized aid, so they realized there's something very violent going on in Germany. And then later on, we know that...
what did they do about it? What did they do about it?
I mean, they raised $2 million, I remember $2 million in June 1933 to kind of provide aid for people who lost their jobs in Germany and for the communities that they can support the Jews. So there was something going on, but then it is also that more and more information was kept because the press was kind of regulated. More and more people left Germany. At a certain point, consulates were closing down, the embassies, journalists went down, so there was a limited set of sources. And then the problem was later on, when the killing started, it was problematic because people just didn't believe the bits and pieces they got of information. So there was information about radio, via radio broadcasts, BBC, or information which kind of came via people who escaped from camps. But the problem is also, so I found, for example, dozens of cases where people in Germany also discussed the mass killing. The problem is, how do we make sense also out of it? What is, how you can get a complete picture? Nobody could at the time, yeah, as we have it today. So I think I actually applaud everybody who had more a sixth sense that what is going on. So for example, I think in the fall of 1939, somebody from the World Jewish Congress writes a letter to Genf and says, you have to be aware of what is going on in Germany and in Poland. We face probably the extermination of 2 million Jews in the future. This looks a lot like the Armenian genocide. So some people had a sense, and they didn't need a lot of clues, but many didn't. And so this was really difficult, I think.
Okay, the final, almost final question.
Hello, my name is Lauren. In your studies, have you ever came across any resistance artists, Jewish artists, that tried to create pieces, or pieces destroyed, or are there any artists that you've studied?
That's a good question. So I mean, we know of some poems of some writers. Then I'm blanking now on the name, but there is a very famous painter in the Netherlands who painted a lot of pictures after the occupation about kind of where the topic was the persecution of the Jews. So you have artists who work even in concentration camps and kind of illegally used their capabilities to kind of paint. So there is actually a lot. Music, I mean, there was music. So we have artists also. I mean, they are part of the story. Yeah, I didn't focus on this yet because I think you can even find more publications on artists than on what I was talking about.
Yeah, I'm Nancy.
Final question.
Nancy Gilmore, and who was talking about the religious support. I was wondering, specifically, what did the Roman Catholic Church, how was it involved in either trying to help resist, either within Germany or worldwide? The Pope, what was being said?
Yeah, these are not so good stories. So, I mean, the Catholic Church is also not a homogeneous institution. So there was not a lot of support because the Catholic Church was more concerned about the persecution of Catholic members of the church in Germany than about the Jews. And they feared when they speak out for the Jews, then they will be attacked, which they already were. And sometimes even in connection. So, for example, in the spring of May 1935, there were riots against Catholics in Munich, which then extended to Jews in Munich. So there was fear about that they were attacked, and then the Catholic Church also was part of the persecution. They were, a lot of the people, of the perpetrators were Catholics, members of the Catholic Church. They were even, especially in the eastern countries, so beyond Germany, like Poland or Ukraine, they were kind of supporting the anti-Jewish measures and also the killing. So there's a lot of not so good stories about the Catholic Church. When we look at Germany, in the beginning you have let's say the lower member, kind of the lower ranks, they're often more supportive than the institution or let's say the Pope. And it's a little bit better the picture than even with the Protestants, because the Protestants, they had their own, let's say, so-called Christian church, the German church, and they were fiercely in favor of the Nazis. They were very anti-Semitic. And then you had, on the other hand, the so-called confessional church, which is perceived as progressive, anti-Nazi, but even among them, they were anti-Semites, and they were not often always helping the Jews. And there's this one recently, the case which became known more recently, in 1935, there was a member of the Protestant, the confessional church, a woman, she was a high school teacher. She wrote 10 pages or so of a memorandum with kind of really outlining all the persecution against the Jews, and sent this to their elders or the superiors in the confessional church in Berlin, and said, you have to do something. This can't be that this is nobody speaks up. You have to do something, and they didn't do anything. Yeah. And later on, she actually during the Kristallnacht, she resigns because of the violence from her teaching job, and later on she hides a Jewish woman in her apartment. So she was remarkable, but she's not well known. Yeah. So, and she is more of the exception.